Hello, welcome to Jacobin Talks. My name is Paul Prescod. I'm a contributing editor at Jacobin magazine. I'll be your host for tonight's Jacobin Talk. We do these talks on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, where we bring on left-wing thinkers, writers, and organizers to talk about important topics for the left. Before we start, quickly, I want to plug Jacobin's newest issue, which is Failure is an Option. Not the happiest of titles, but that is where we are right now. You can go to jacobin.com to subscribe or buy the issue in print. And also, we have a great weekend show coming up with Ronan Burtonshaw from the UK joining Ando and Nando, so you don't want to miss that. So tonight, our topic is of extreme importance and relevance. I suspect that one of the biggest fights we'll have with the Biden administration is over the transformations required to address climate change. Our challenge is not simply a technical fix, but how to build a broad-based working-class political movement that takes ecological questions seriously. So we have the perfect guest to discuss this tonight. Matt Huber is an associate professor of geography and the environment at Syracuse University. He's the author of the book Lifeblood, Oil, Freedom, and the Forces of Capital, and has a new book on the way with Verso about class struggle and climate politics. He's also written for Jacobin and Catalyst, where you can find articles such as Ecological Politics for the Working Class and many others. So Matt, I'll let you take it away. Talk about how has environmental politics come to look like what it does today, and where do we go from here?
Great. Thank you so much, Paul, for that intro. And thanks to Jacobin and thanks to Cale Brooks for all the work he does behind the scenes. I got to say, the pandemic has been pretty bleak and isolating at times, but I have to say the Jacobin YouTube channel and what you all are doing has really been a bright spot, and I always look forward to these talks. So it's an honor to be here. So I'd like to start with a kind of basic question, which is why many on the left consider environmental politics a different kind of politics than class politics. Why is environmentalism often classified as a kind of new social movement that came out of the 1960s, where new is supposed to be different than an old social movement grounded in the socialist and labor movements? Now, this is really puzzling for two reasons. First, I'm sure many Jacobin readers think class politics has something to do with what we call material conditions or material interest. And isn't it quite obvious that the environment and natural resources are at the core of our material ability to make a living on this planet? It's really, the straits we're in is about material survival. So how could the destruction of these material conditions of life not be seen as a class issue? Second, it's very strange that the liberal left treats environmentalism as a non-class issue when the right wing uses nothing but naked class appeals in opposing any and all environmental proposals. The right says environmental policies will destroy jobs, they'll make us less competitive, they'll lower the standard of living of the working class. In fact, arch climate villain Charles Koch, I guess he's in the news today. He's feeling some regret about his partisanship over the years. But anyway, he was quoted in the Washington Post in 2016 critiquing climate policy like this: the poorest Americans use 3 times the energy as the percentage of their income as the average American does. So climate policy is going to disproportionately hurt the poor. So this is Charles Koch, friend of the poor. He's really worried about the poor. So what's going on here? To understand this, I want to lay out a more specific definition of class. Jacobin readers will be familiar with the idea that class is not purely about the income you make. It's not only about your education level, your manner of dress, your speech, identity. Class is about your relationship to the means of production. More to the point, class is about production itself. Who controls it and for what purpose? We live in a society where basically a small minority of capitalists own and control the production of almost everything we need in society, like food, energy, housing, medicine, like vaccines, for instance, and they control the production of these things with one goal in mind: profit. And since the vast majority of the working class doesn't own the means of production, they must work, usually for a capitalist boss, to get the money to access the things that we need. So we don't often think about it as much, but understanding class in terms of your relationship to production is itself an ecological issue. As Ellen Meiksins Wood once put it, quote, "Production is essential to human existence," unquote. So we don't really live as ecological beings unless we produce our means of life. And this is, of course, at the core of kind of the Marxist project of historical materialism, and rooting our understanding of class relations in production relations. And in an ecological sense, obviously in capitalism, the working class doesn't survive ecologically unless they have access to money via the market, which means the working class is profoundly alienated actually from the ecological conditions of existence, which is a problem. But more to the point, environmental destruction is usually caused by the people that control and own production. So for instance, the industrial sector, the production of things like cement, chemicals, steel, this is by far the highest source of carbon emissions in the economy. Obviously, the production of fossil fuels is the primary industry causing climate change. And if you basically find, most serious pollution or landscape destruction around the world is going to be traced back to a corporation, like a logging firm or a mining firm that's trying to turn nature into profit, right? So I'm here today to explain how environmental politics became about many other things besides production. It became about what we consume or how we consume. It became a politics of believing or denying science, or it became a kind of wonky policy game where we try to correct for the market's failures to sort of price the environment correctly. In short, over the last 50 years, environmental politics has become the domain of the middle and professional classes and become completely removed from traditional socialist and labor politics focused on the point of production. But it wasn't always like this. In the 1960s, it was generally understood that the environmental crisis was caused by industrial producers dumping toxic pollution into the water, into the air, and of course, into workers' bodies in the factory itself. The early victories of the environmental movement, most notably the Clean Air and Water Act of the 1970s, were essentially strict pollution controls levied at industrial capitalists, forcing them to stop polluting. And it actually worked really well, this kind of production-oriented policy. And at the heart of this production-centered environmental politics were some notable organizers in the radical labor movement. So as Connor Kilpatrick has discussed in Jacobin, one of my favorite pieces, one of the most powerful environmental activists was union leader Tony Mazzocchi of the oil and chemical and atomic workers. According to his biographer, Les Leopold, quote, "Mazzocchi's conceptual breakthrough was that pollution always starts in the workplace and then moves to the community and natural environment," unquote. So Mazzocchi realized that corporations were putting profits ahead of the health of the workers in his union. And workers were really, in the chemical industry, were getting these rare diseases and cancer at alarming rates. So he realized he needed to sort of mobilize his union and organize them to leverage their power to force the capitalists to stop poisoning them, essentially. As Mazzocchi himself put it, quote, "When you start to interfere with the forces of production, you're going to the heart of the beast." And in an environmental sense, that's absolutely still true. So what did Mazzocchi do? Once he became a national staffer in the union, he marshaled the tremendous resources of the union, which comes from member dues, of course, and it just creates this sort of infrastructure. So he organized a tour of OCAW locals in wider public meetings all across the nation. He brought toxicologists, epidemiologists to explain in plain terms to the workers the toxic risks they were facing every day. He organized worker testimony about their own working conditions and these kind of public-facing events, and even organized workers to go testify in congressional hearings. So this mass kind of union-led political education campaign for worker safety not only led workers to demand safe workplaces from their bosses, and they in fact threatened to strike if not, It also organized wider mass public pressure for real policy change. Mazzocchi leveraged his allies in the wider social movements, including folks like Ralph Nader, to organize around occupational and environmental safety. And all of this pressure led to the Occupational Health and Safety Act of 1970, which established OSHA as a specific regulatory arm of the state that can force capitalist producers to spend money to ensure a safer workplace. So you couldn't imagine a more successful class-based environmental strategy aimed at the point of production. Yet, starting in the 1970s, class-based environmental politics began to fade, along with the labor movement and unionization rates. Of course, industrial employment itself fell precipitously through automation, offshoring, and the rest of it. In the United States, the shift to a so-called knowledge economy and service sector employment tended to displace material production as a visible aspect of many workers' lives. So now I want to kind of pivot to explain how the environmental movement shifted completely away from this kind of class-centered struggle over material production and toward a politics that I will argue is really rooted in the professional class. So as Adolph Reed often says in another context, environmental politics is class politics today, but it's just the politics for the professional class. It has shed any relationship with the working class or socialist or labor politics. In fact, especially in the 1970s and 80s, many radical theorists of ecological politics, even socialists like Andre Gores or James O'Connor, explicitly framed the ecology movement as, again, this new social movement that was very much against and different than the traditional workers' movement and socialist movement focused on production. So what is the professional class? It's very complicated, and I don't really have enough time to get into the whole PMC debate, but I do want to make 4 kind of crucial points. First, the professional class is about marshaling credentials, like degrees, licenses, to carve out advantages in the labor market. As many have pointed out, this kind of focus on educational attainment means the professional class really believes a lot in meritocracy and sort of seeing one's own material position as dependent on their knowledge and smarts. Second, the professional class project is ultimately one aimed towards some nominal degree of autonomy. Now, both in kind of professionalized workplaces, but also more importantly, in attaining a kind of middle class level of material security and comfort rooted in this kind of standard of consumption that kind of emerged out of post-World War II America, based on basically car and home ownership. Third, when you look at the real movers in environmental politics, it's self-evident that it is mostly, if not completely, composed of these kinds of people. Who is driving the climate movement today? It's often journalists, it's professors, it's scientists, it's NGO professionals, it's government workers. In short, it's very smart people with the credentials to understand and explain the crisis we face. Fourth, and perhaps most crucially, the professional class is a relatively small percentage of the society as a whole. If you just think for a minute, 2/3 of Americans lack a bachelor's degree. You can immediately conclude that we're not talking about a kind of majoritarian basis for a mass political movement. And I don't really have time to get into it, but I think managerial occupations are I think, a separate category. And if we, based on that assumption, you can see in this chart here that Kim Moody estimates that the professional class is roughly 22% of the workforce. Many of which, we should add, he rightly claims are facing a steady erosion of their working conditions and security. He calls them proletarianizing parts of the professional class, which we're all familiar with. So it's a small percentage of the population. So what characterizes professional class environmental politics? 2 general points here. First, it's deeply invested in a politics of knowledge, a politics of science, a politics of belief and denial in the science. So Joe Biden and the Democrats understand their professional class base when the election campaign was in large part just going around shouting, "I believe science," right? That was one of his, if he had any message, that was one of them. So it's not only that environmental activists are themselves experts and aware and abreast of the science, but it's also that they're just very offended by all the science denial and disinformation going on, particularly in the so-called post-truth era or whatever. Second, because of their relative material comfort, professional class environmental politics is rooted in an anxiety around their own consumption. Thus, they tend to frame any and all solutions to the ecological crisis in terms of reducing consumption. In my Catalyst piece, I try to show how kind of carbon or ecological footprint accounting creates these tools that attribute 100% of responsibility for environmental problems to consumers, not the capitalists who control production. So every time you consume something, you might forget there's someone else profiting from the production of that thing you consumed. And footprint accounting just takes them completely off the hook and says it's all you, the consumers, who are to blame. And actually, I've noticed many leftists, when they talk about class responsibility or class inequality when it comes to climate change, they actually only can think in these terms of consumer footprints. You may have heard that the top 10% of the income spectrum is responsible for half of global emissions. Well, they're using consumption-based footprint data for those estimates. But class is not about your income and what you spend your money on. What I'm trying to suggest is it's about production and who actually controls the production and profits from the stuff you're consuming. So in my forthcoming book on class and climate politics for Verso, I try to categorize 3 core professional class types that have driven environmental politics for the last several decades. And I try to explain how each is kind of antagonistic to working class politics. And I want to be very clear, there's really no inherent problem with professional class people doing environmental politics. I mean, look at me. I'm a professor and I'm kind of like painfully of this class, right? But if professional class politics is actively antagonistic to the masses of working people, that's a problem. And so we can have professionals involved in environmental politics, but we have to orient it outward to the masses of people in ways that resonate. And so I'm going to explain these types and why they don't do that, right? The first type is what I call the science communicators, who are either natural scientists themselves or are otherwise deeply invested in knowing what the science says, or believes, like environmental journalists. This is the type of person who the primary problem in environmental politics is seen as a lack of awareness, a lack of understanding, or a lack of, or sort of a total outright denial of scientific knowledge. And it believes that if the masses truly understood the science, action would kind of inevitably follow. So all of society would kind of wake up. And so obviously this politics of knowledge is not really about production. In fact, these people seem to think the worst thing that the fossil fuel industry does is fund fake science and climate denial. And it's not that they produce fossil fuels for profit, which is their main activity. So as you can see, a few years ago, there's been this massive campaign over the last few years that hashtag Exxon knew, and which shows that Exxon did scientific studies and discovered climate change in the 1970s. And then funded climate denial for the decade since, which is obviously horrible and awful, but this politics of knowledge kind of shifts our attention away from production. And Jacobin readers won't be surprised to understand that this kind of knowledge politics, this focus on belief or denial, is really not speaking to the direct material concerns of the masses of working people. If anything, it can kind of alienate ordinary people if they don't quite understand all the ins and outs of climate science. The second type of professional class environmental politics is what I call the policy technocrat, or what we would call maybe a wonky person, whose expertise is more likely to be kind of in law or policy studies. They might work in think tanks, academia, or professionalized nonprofits. And these types seek to design kind of smart policy solutions to environmental problems. They believe that they can use logic and rational policy design to kind of sway politicians and the public towards these sort of logical solutions. And for the last several decades, these policy technocrats have been most convinced that they can design these really elegant free market policies like carbon pricing, carbon taxes, cap and trade, that really channels the market, the price mechanism, and the profit motive to allow the private sector to really solve all our environmental problems through the market. More hilariously, they actually believe that they can convince Republicans to support these market-friendly environmental policies, despite all the evidence to the contrary. Perhaps the epitome of this kind of politics in the United States and around the world is an organization called the Citizens Climate Lobby, which is trying to pass a policy, a very wonky policy called the carbon fee and dividend, which is like a carbon tax, but it redistributes the revenues to households as a dividend. And to attract Republican support for this policy, they try to make sure they announce from the outset that this policy is, quote, revenue neutral. That is, it doesn't increase government revenue or increase government spending, which we know the right doesn't like, right? And they're going to distribute it all to households. But, you know, the problem is anyone on the left should realize that we need way more public spending, way more government spending and investment in public investment to actually tackle the like deep infrastructure problems with doing this energy transition. So as you can see in this image on their website here, one of their slogans, and this is not a joke, this is their slogan, it's time to outsmart climate change. So this is what I mean by professional class politics. I mean, literally they think we're going to outsmart climate change somehow. As Marx would say, though, these policy technocrats are obsessed with the realm of exchange and correcting the market. Whereas, as Marx would tell us, class relations of capitalism, the real class relations, are more apparent in the hidden abode of production. And obviously, Miyazaki understood that very well. That's where pollution is rooted. That's where the workers' interest against pollution is at. So these policy technocrat proposals are also just not particularly popular amongst the masses of people. The liberal, environmental, the crunchy, hippie, green state of Washington rejected carbon tax referendums, both in 2016 and in 2018 by very large margins. More to the point, these people, the policy technocrats, actually think, you know, the whole thing is to raise energy prices to take into account the environmental cost of production through a carbon tax or a fee or whatever. And we've already seen how the masses of working class people will respond to that kind of policy in France, with the Yellow Vest movement basically rising up and revolting against carbon tax. And you know, they had this incredible slogan, quote, politicians talk about the end of the world, but we're just talking about the end of the month. So these policies have, you know, don't speak to those end of the month concerns that most people are focused on. But for professional class people, raising energy prices is actually attractive because they think they and everyone else are consuming too much. So a price hike will incentivize better behavior and amongst the kind of irresponsible masses who are consuming too much, right? But given that 60% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, are drowning in debt, and only exacerbated by the COVID pandemic, it's obvious why this kind of program is totally antagonistic to the interest of the working class. And consequently, workers are increasingly receptive to the right-wing view that environmental policy is just this kind of liberal elite thing that's meant to destroy their economic lives. Finally, the third type of professional class environmentalist is what I call the anti-system radical, whose own exposure to the science of ecological collapse leads to a kind of political radicalization. These types of folks are rampant in academia and the areas I traffic in, let me tell you. And a lot of this radicalization they go through is rooted in a core contradiction. The material project of the professional class is to achieve this economic security I told you about. But this leads to this kind of guilt and anxiety about how they and all their social networks are kind of complicit through this affluent consumption patterns in the ecological breakdown that's happening. So these folks tend to make proposals that really lead with less, about a whole scale downscaling of society. So they propose reducing consumption. They propose, and the most popular term of this is, of course, degrowth. Like, we want to just degrow, downscale production and consumption at a society-wide scale. This kind of activist thinks the ecological crisis is really rooted in rejecting like this system, right? And they talk about system change too. In fact, many would call themselves eco-socialists, but because they tend to reject the system at a societal level, they don't really always make clear the very real class divisions within a society or within the system. So rather than just saying we need to degrow in general, a class approach would hopefully clearly make clear that it's the capitalist class and the wealthy that need to degrow so that we can actually grow a lot of things that we need. We need to grow green energy. We need to grow public transit. Most importantly, working class people need to see real growth in their ability to secure the very basics of life, which in America, people they're struggling to just get food, housing, healthcare, and the basics of life itself in their lives. These anti-system radicals are not really interested in transforming industrial production through class struggle from within, like Mazaki, but they're more interested in kind of constructing these kind of small is beautiful micro alternatives at the local community scale, like a DIY, off-grid living, a little kind of small scale agricultural commune or something like that. All these micro alternatives are kind of rooted in a kind of anti-capitalist strategy Eric Olin Wright mentioned as escaping capitalism, as to kind of create these micro alternatives outside of capitalism. One example of a degrowth activist is a person named Francois Schneider, and I'm probably butchering that, but his picture you can see here. Now, he is a professional class person if you've ever saw one. He has a PhD. He's the founder of the Research and Degrowth think tank in Paris. And he took a year-long hike around France with this donkey to talk to people about degrowth and to illustrate the benefits of frugal living and traditional animal-based transportation. And now he lives in what is described as a bare basics tiny house on the French Catalan border. So I just let that speak for itself, but it's clear why this kind of politics of less, this politics of invoking whole-scale downscaling across the board is not going to have wide mass working class appeal where people are already living with less, people are already struggling just to meet their basic needs. So to summarize our three categories, we have three different types of professional class environmental activists: science communicators, policy technocrats, and anti-system radicals, each with its own set of slogans and theories of change. And all of them avoid confronting production and don't have really wide appeal amongst the masses of working class people. And I think it's also worth mentioning that none of these movements are succeeding in solving the ecological crisis we face. So we really need a massive shift in strategy if we're going to be able to build a movement with the power to take on some of the most powerful and wealthy corporations in world history. So how can we build a broader working class environmental politics? My Catalyst piece was written in those heady days of 2019 when there was so much energy and enthusiasm around AOC's Green New Deal, which was a clearly working class environmental program rooted in a jobs guarantee, free healthcare, and unlike the policy technocrats, they proposed cheaper energy for struggling households. But as we sit here today, November 2020, on the heels of Biden's victory and a likely divided legislature, I think we should honestly admit that the likelihood of winning something like a Green New Deal in the short term is not particularly high. And of course, we know Biden famously opposed the Green New Deal in his campaign. So until we can build the kind of electoral power to actually deliver power at the state level, which is what obviously the Bernie campaign was trying to do, we need to shift strategy. My Catalyst piece was titled Ecological Politics for the Working Class, but I think Sam Gendon and Leo Panich have been saying what we really need now is an ecological politics of and in the working class, that really is rooted in the working class. And I think that kind of politics really has to start where the working class is already organized, and that is the small but still powerful union movement, the same movement where Tony Mazzocchi delivered OSHA. It's already clear that some of the most militant and left-wing unions in education and healthcare sectors and other sectors support things like a Green New Deal. But I think socialists need to recognize we also need workers in unions that are more at the kind of point of production of the industries we actually need to transform to get off fossil fuels and to solve the climate crisis. We know we need to transform the energy system. So the conversation usually leads quickly to a lot of hand-wringing about union coal miners and people in the oil and gas industry and how it's going to be a challenge to get those workers. And how we need a kind of just transition. But the whole, which actually Tony Mazzocchi came up with as well, but the whole just transition framework kind of treats the workers as victims of this transition. But the problem we're facing is the transition's not happening. We need to win the transition. And to do that, we need to harness worker power, not as victims, but as workers that have power to force the transition, right? So I'm a scholar of energy. And when you start to study this, you realize the entire decarbonization project is really a relatively straightforward thing. It's what David Roberts from Vox has called the electrify everything strategy. Basically what we need to do, we need to decarbonize electricity, make it 100% zero carbon energy sources. And then we need to electrify all the parts of the economy that run on fossil fuels, like transportation, buildings, and industrial systems. So this means there's literally one strategic sector for the climate movement. It's the electric utility sector. Jane McAlevey has really made clear that the labor movement can't just try to organize everywhere. It needs to target specific strategic sectors for building working class power. And for her, for very good reason, she's located the education, healthcare, and logistics sectors. But for the climate movement, I think it's got to be clear it's the electric utility sector. And guess what? This sector is one of the most unionized in literally the entire economy. The electric power generation and transmission and distribution sector is 26.3 unionized. Some occupations are in the 40s in terms of union representation, 40%. So these, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, the Utility Workers Union of America are the main unions representing hundreds of thousands of electrical workers across the country. And what rank and file workers in this sector will tell you is that they're very worried about losing their jobs to climate change that's going to force us off fossil fuels in the electric sector. And although there's much enthusiasm among environmentalists about the vast expansion of renewable energy projects all across the country and the declining cost of this energy source, what they don't mention is that this new form of renewable energy capitalism is almost entirely non-union. A 2020 energy and employment report found 4 and 6% of the solar and wind industries are unionized, very small. So to get unions behind a Green New Deal style transformation, we on the socialist left really need to make clear that the energy transition is going to be built by union jobs. So we need to organize the rank and file workers in electric unions to use their union power like Mazzocchi did to launch a kind of massive national campaign that fights for all these new energy projects to have what are called project labor agreements that mandate the use of union labor for these projects. So as IBEW worker Ryan Pollack argued in Jacobin, we can actually win the building trades to a Green New Deal if we actually make this case to union workers that a Green New Deal means more jobs. He also suggests we need to organize a kind of socialist rank and file strategy within these unions. So socialists, just like we're joining teachers unions, we should be joining IBEW unions and Utility Workers of America unions to try to radicalize them from the inside and try to promote this kind of radical green transition we need to solve the climate crisis within the unions themselves. And I want to add one note that might be controversial to some, but any pro-labor or pro-union Green New Deal is going to have to organize to protect the already existing good union jobs that are producing 100% carbon-free energy in the nuclear power sector. So much of the debate over nuclear is quite technocratic. It's based on the economic cost or the environmental risks. But socialists, if they want to be strategic, we have to find a way to win over these unions in the electric sector. And I think to win them over, we're going to have to start by supporting this heavily unionized nuclear system that produces 20% of our clean electricity already on the grid. So we want to both protect and expand that clean energy source. And promoting that will help us get the unions on our side. So in closing, sorry, I've gone a little longer than I planned. A Tony Mazzocchi-style union-led politics of production is still very possible to win a Green New Deal in the same way we won OSHA. But we on the environmental left, we really need to just kind of wake up from the neoliberal slumber of the last 40, 50 years and realize the road to environmental change, the road to power goes through class politics at the point of production. So as Mazzocchi says, we really need to go to the heart of the beast. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, Matt. That was great. I have a few questions myself, but just a reminder, everyone, please put your questions in the chat, and myself and Kale will collect them and definitely ask them to Matt. So please make sure you put your questions there. But I'll start off with a few of my own. So, you mentioned about the role of labor militancy in winning a Green New Deal, and also saying, you don't necessarily always have to engage with the unions in the fossil fuel sector. There are other strategic sectors, but I think you would agree that at some point we have to engage with the building trades, if this is going to work. So what do you think of initiatives like the New York Climate Jobs Program, which is where many building trades in New York State got together with some environmental groups, and they hammered out like a green jobs program for the whole state of New York. So, what do you think of that initiative? Do you think that can or should be replicated in other parts of the country?
Yes, it's a great initiative, and it's a great example of basically when you do environmental policy where you bring unions to the table from the start, where they are actually involved in the construction of these policies of energy transition, you're gonna leverage all this power that already exists. Now we talk about how the union movement is really defeated in a lot of ways, but we just saw in the election, like Unite Here, like mobilizing all these people to knock doors, because the unions still have this like institutional structures and power bases that can be leveraged for these systems. So the Climate Jobs Program from New York State was a great example of kind of environmentalists trying to really get unions on their side from the start of a policy making. Now, I live in New York State. One thing I am very worried about is Cuomo, as he's wont to do, he's kind of responding to a lot of the more progressive climate laws that have been passed in the last couple of years by basically trying to open up much of the state to private renewable energy developments that are massive and large-scale solar farms and wind farms, and he's going to hand over these contracts to private renewable developers, and it's not clear to me that those private renewable developers are going to really have much union labor and so forth. So the union jobs report that came out in 2014 had a lot of great plans and ideas. My worry now is that Cuomo being like, he's much more interested in kind of creating these kind of public-private partnerships. And if we have a bunch of private renewable development all over the state that's non-union, not only is that I'm not convinced the private sector is going to deliver the decarbonization at the rate we need anyway, but it's also just not, it's going to alienate and piss off the unions in the electric sector that I mentioned that are working in nuclear plants, but also, there are in these electrical unions I mentioned, obviously a lot of workers working at fossil fuel powered electric plants. So we need to convince those workers that if we're shutting down a coal plant, they're going to have jobs at a nuclear plant, or at a union mandated renewable energy project somewhere. But if we just let Cuomo hand over much of New York State's countryside to private renewable developers, it's not going to go that way.
Got a good question from the chat. How do we organize workers in the electric industry around shifting the industry to green jobs without relying on a neoliberal meritocratic approach that workers just need better education?
Let's see. Let me kind of think about that. Yeah, you know, a lot of the narrative in the kind of green jobs canon is all about training and retraining and so forth, which does, I think, channel this kind of credentialization of, you know, and we should be clear, a lot of these workers in electrical unions are professionals. Like, they are people with professional skills. They're electricians, they're, you know, electrical engineers there, but there are also a lot of, you know, people that work on staff and doing the phones or cleaning up the power plants. So there's a lot of membership in these unions that are different types of skills and different types of jobs that they're doing. But we don't want to kind of like try to be like, hey, come onto this Green New Deal and we'll retrain you and maybe you'll get a job someday. You know, we want to make the argument that the green energy transition is going to be about employing all the existing union members in these unions, and that's the only way to really get them on board and to support them. And again, I think we need to start making this case that if unions don't have a kind of proactive strategy to get on board of the energy transition that we all know needs to happen, then they're going to be left in the dust by this kind of renewable energy capitalism, which is largely non-union. So I think they understand they're facing a threat, but the unions are not quite organizing this kind of long-term strategy to actually deal with this for their membership, really.
Yeah, and just kind of I'll put an anecdote to that. There was a former president of a steelworkers local in Philly that we worked with, someone that is totally on board with the idea of just transition, but he told us you got to use a different word because at this point in history, there's been so many bad experiences of retraining that's never happened or led to a worse job. So I think it's, you know, sometimes the branding too has to be worked on, you know, based on experience workers have had. So I think, you know, the climate movement a lot of times is thought of as a youth movement, and you kind of see these like new so-called new movements arising and new kinds of organizations. So I'm curious your thoughts on the Extinction Rebellion. This movement kind of seemed to pop out of nowhere, really caused a spectacle and some huge mobilizations. Do you see this kind of as another manifestation of like PMC environmental politics, or was this kind of pointing the way to possibly something different?
Yeah, I actually was in the UK about a year ago, and I met up with some XR people, and I was trying to explain this critique of the kind of very myopic professional class outlook of much environmental politics. And I swear it was like these people had never even thought of that critique. They were like so in these kind of professional class logics that it was impossible to get them to think differently. But I will say, and this, I'm glad you brought this up because I really wanted to talk about this, which is obviously Extinction Rebellion is doing something I think that's really important, which is they understand that we're not going to win unless there's mass disruption, right? And so they're using direct action tactics to shut down highways or airports, and most famously, they shut down a tube stop and really alienated a lot of working class commuters in the process. So you can have questions about the strategy, but I think those of us on the left know that kind of like disruption can really force elites to kind of have to pay attention to the demands of a social movement. So that I think is good, but the problem is they come out of a long-standing, decades in the making tradition of direct action environmentalism, From, there's these tree sitters that would sit in trees to try to get loggers to stop knocking down trees. There are people getting in front of coal trains. There's people trying to block pipelines. Naomi Klein called these people blockadia, these blockadia movements. But the thing is, all these movements, and I haven't done the analysis or collected the data, but I would bet all these activists are these kind of professional class, sort of anti-system radical type people. They're always disrupting from the outside. They're trying to disrupt a pipeline as activists, like from the outside, which is very different than the type of disruption that we know can work in the labor movement, which is workers disrupting from the inside of production, shutting down profits for capital at its source, at the point of production. And that's just a different style of disruption. And the problem with environmental direct action disruption is it often alienates, again, the workers in those sectors. So you have people getting in front of coal mines, getting in front of coal trains, shutting down logging operations in the Pacific Northwest. Well, guess who was most pissed off about those environmental activists were the workers in the logging sector, the workers laying the pipeline. So it sort of reproduces this jobs versus environment, this sort of environmentalist versus the workers kind of narrative that we've been just banging our heads against the wall with for decades. So that's why I think we do need to realize, like, we need to actually get some of the workers in these sectors on board to disrupt from the inside, like Mazzocchi did, right? And that was his whole plan.
Yeah, and I think, one of the most important parts from the book about Mazzocchi, the man who hated work and loved labor, which everyone should go out and read right away, is he made sure that environmentalists the union was working with, they never took action without first communicating with the union and the workers understanding exactly why that was happening. And I think that's key. See, another question that kind of intersects with something I was going to ask. So basically, since the Green New Deal came on the scene, as a phrase and like as a project, basically, has it moved the needle at all? Like, has the branding worked? Do you think it's convinced working people? And I'll add just a little, more specifically, like, how did you feel Bernie framed it during his 2020 election campaign? Do you think he did a good job of presenting that argument and framing it? And also other left elected officials that have come since then, like, how are we doing on the Green New Deal? Is it working, or do we need a changing course?
I think it's hit or miss. Obviously, during the campaign, the Green New Deal became this kind of very vague buzzword that Biden and Harris were kind of running away from, because it just sort of meant vaguely left-wing radical socialism, right? Which we shouldn't be worried about. We just built a presidential campaign based on left-wing socialism that almost won. But to me, I hate to be a Debbie Downer, but the rollout of the Green New Deal in February of 2019 was a disaster. AOC's office, the resolution itself, I think, was excellent. They did a great job with it. You can have quibbles here and there. But they did a rollout where they released this thing called a frequently asked questions, a FAQ document. It's probably still on the internet somewhere. And it seemed like her chief of staff just did this like at 2 a.m. And it was almost like a stream of consciousness of ideas about the Green New Deal, where it mentioned the things like, we want to get rid of cow farts, we want to ban aviation, and it mentioned hamburgers are no good. And that document, it's almost like it was made for the right and for Fox News and for all those kind of right-wing outlets to just take it and run with it and say, this is what the Green New Deal is. It's going to ban your hamburgers. It's going to ban, you're not going to be able to fly anymore. And it just fell right into that kind of all environmentalism is about austerity and taking things away from you. Now, again, the resolution itself was about a jobs guarantee. That it should have been right at the center of the rollout. The resolution itself even mentioned Medicare for all, which people got angry with because they thought this is a climate policy. How can it be related to all these things? But what was really brilliant about it is they said there's two crises we're facing. It's inequality and it's climate change, and we can deal with both of them through this Green New Deal. So unfortunately, now it's become this toxic label that people associate with these right-wing memes and right-wing talking points that can be attributed to that disastrous fact document. But I think it's only going to be recovered and recuperated if we do just really hammer home the jobs part of that and the public sector jobs part of that, where it's that, and that's where I think Bernie really distinguished himself from all the rest of the candidates, because he was about massively expanding publicly owned electricity. He wanted to massively expand the Tennessee Valley Authority and other federally owned public power electricity producers. And if you were able to pull that off, he would have, tried to say we're going to massively expand these publicly owned electricity systems, but we're going to do it by hiring more and more unions from the IBEW and the Utility Workers of America. And that was good. But a lot of that was kind of buried in Bernie's plan. Sometimes I would get a little frustrated with Bernie because he kind of, Bernie, he would have his beautiful stump speech that he repeats every place. And he would just say, we need to take on the fossil fuel industry and transition to 100%. I'm not going to go into a Bernie impression. Sorry. We're going to transition to 100% sustainable energy is what he said. And he would just say that over and over again. It's kind of funny. He would never, almost very rarely, would he say the words Green New Deal, or very rarely would he really kind of precisely map out this kind of jobs guarantee, massive expansion of public investment. He just had his talking points, and that's kind of what he stuck to, which, that there's a lot to say of why that's part of why Bernie's so effective. But he kind of, in many ways, his talking points were similar from 2016. He didn't quite update them for the Green New Deal moment in ways that I think would have been more effective. But, that's yesterday's news, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you said that, because it was a frustration point for me too, because if you went on his website, he had a worked out plan of, for, I think it was 4 or 5 years, you will get that same pay that you left off with. Yeah. And the whole debate, I'm like, let's say that, because I think kind of what you're speaking to is, at this moment, it's like Green New Deal is like, okay, that's nice. So are unicorns. So is $1 million in my bed the next day. So, and I'm curious what you think about this. It might seem counterintuitive because of the scale of what the Green New Deal has to be. But, if you look at Medicare for all, at least in my opinion, it kind of inherently has to be this national level project, because I think most states genuinely can't really do a state single payer model successfully. So it's kind of like national, federal, or nothing in a way. Obviously, the organizing you do is at the local level. I kind of think with the Green New Deal, it's kind of in reverse, where it's like, if you can, if the New York climate jobs can achieve part of that program, so if you can renovate energy efficient schools, public schools, get them all renovated in the state, and prove to unions at the local level, and I don't mean hyper local, but state, city level, that these jobs can exist and it can work. It's almost like you're building up local to the national, where you're kind of filling out, this is what it actually means. It's not just like a guy thing. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's kind of counterintuitive, because this is this massive project that I think we got to fill out, put some meat on the bones at the local level, and prove to workers that, like, okay, this is real. Like, in my city, we created all these jobs, renovating schools, whatever it is.
Yeah. And if you look at the original New Deal, it was that beautiful combo. It was obviously a lot of federal spending and programs, but they gave a lot of autonomy to local communities to kind of design the projects and hire the workers and in the public sector to create these things. So I think That was one of the coolest the sort of visions of the Green New Deal was that it was going to really impact people at the community level where they see it, like they see, oh, that's the thing that hired my uncle to build that, to retrofit the school or to build a energy project down the road or whatever it might be. I do think, unfortunately, with the time scale we're facing, we do need a broader than local sort of strategy, though. We obviously need a global strategy for climate change. Like we need it fast. So that's actually why I liked Bernie's plan so much, because he did have this federally owned public power aspect to it that was going to massively expand public power at the federal level. A lot of public power movements are often focused on the local level. They want to municipalize their electric grid at like the city level or a rural kind of cooperative, but we just don't have time to kind of take over municipal utilities and public power at a city level. Like Boulder's been trying to take over their utility for a decade, and it's just not. So we need this kind of larger vision, and that can be at the state scale. In New York now, we actually have a huge TVA-like publicly owned power system called NYPA, the New York Power Authority, which owns a lot of the hydropower in our state. It was set up by Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932 as this kind of big state level sort of investment in energy and hydropower, and it still exists, and it produces a huge amount of electricity for the state of New York. So one of the public power campaign that I've been involved with in DSA and other places is really hoping to try to just take that publicly owned utility in NYPA and massively expand it and get them to start producing clean zero carbon energy all over the state on that basis of because when you have publicly owned power, you can kind of have different priorities than just paying your shareholders and making profits which is what the private investor-owned utilities, that's all they're kind of focused on. And obviously we can't trust them to decarbonize at the speed and scale we need. So when we make them public, we can actually make them susceptible to pressure and democratic pressure to force them to the decarbonization rates we need at a larger scale. And
so you kind of anticipated the question I was going to next about, using the public sector and public utilities. So I'm going to ask about two more questions maybe before wrapping up. So the next one is, do you think, when it's all said and done, even if this is not what we campaign on necessarily or say a lot, does the data suggest that the average person in the global north will need to curb their resource consumption, even if that's not a good strategy to campaign on? Is that the reality?
That's a tough one, because I actually, that book that I wrote called Lifeblood that was put up there, it's actually oh, there it is. it's an incredible critique of American consumption. Well, God, I should not say incredible. I didn't mean to say that my book was incredible. What I meant to say is that the point of the book is that it's a critique of the incredible privatism of American consumption, which is basically we've set up this incredibly privatized system of mass consumption where you have private transportation and single family private homes, and everyone has like this whole set of private appliances, and it's like the antithesis of a socialist vision of consumption. And so when you get into these conversations, people say, well, aren't you saying that we just need to let people in America consume like they're consuming? And I would say no. Like a socialist would want a massive public investment in public transit to get off automobiles. It would want massive investments in public housing and green, beautiful social public housing. And it would be a totally different vision of consumption that would not, I would agree that we're probably we need to reduce particularly the wealthiest consumption in particular ways. But what we need to do is transform consumption. And for most Americans, even if they live in the suburbs and they might even have a car, they don't have enough. They're in debt. They don't get the healthcare they need. We have millions of people that are food insecure in this country. People cannot afford housing. So obviously the vision is expanding their consumption of the working class people. Again, like I would say about 60 to 70% of this country is in dire straits and needs help, right? And so for those people, it's going to obviously be increasing their access to the basics of life. But for maybe the top 30%, yes, like less private consumption, more public. Green New Deal people talked about public luxury, which I kind of like that idea. We need more public luxury, less, this privatized consumption landscape is alienating. It's soul crushing. It's not good. And we want to dismantle it in a way, but we want to dismantle it by saying what comes out of it is better and more. It's more time. It's more, if we could have a shorter work week, it's more time. If we could have these public goods, it's a better form of consumption. And it's not just about maintaining this highly alienating, privatized mode of life that just sucks, right? Just sucks.
Well said. So I'll ask you one last question. I'll end with one of these annoying questions where you have to speculate, and it's not really fair to you that I'm asking you this. But so we know Biden is who he is. We don't really need to say more. So do you think in the near future, though, if there's going to be, which there's likely to be, increased extreme weather events, do you think the consciousness on environmental issues will keep growing just because of the material reality, and even may we be surprised that a Biden administration might be even slightly more active on this, again, just because material reality is hitting them in the face? I guess what do you see for the future of these next 4 years?
Yeah, I think consciousness is already increasing. I mean, you look at the wildfires in California, and I think so that's on the good side. But I think Biden is, he's going to just do the normal kind of, like I expect there's going to be investment, a stimulus package that invests in kind of renewables and green energy, but it's just not going to be at the scale that we need to. I mean, I often say and this is a very kind of professional class, like science way of thinking about it, but it's the climate doesn't care that Trump is no longer in office and Biden is, unless Biden is going to transform the energy system at the scale we need, which he's not. So that's why, Bernie was the first candidate that many climate scientists thought like his plan actually was at the scale of the problem. Like it actually had a plan to transform the energy system at the speed and scale of what we need. So it's pretty clear to me that scale of transformation is not going to happen from Biden, or especially with a divided Congress. It's only going to happen from this workplace organizing strikes. Jane McAlevey is talking about basically we've got to relearn how to strike and strike a lot to force the elites to pay attention to this transformation that's needed. And more workers are realizing that we need to do this transformation because they're seeing the wildfires, they're seeing the superstorms. And I think, again, like in the electricity sector, those workers are actually seeing that, hey, if I'm working in a coal-fired power plant, it's my job that's on the line. So I need to get involved and organize for, that these unions can be part of this energy transition. So, but I think it's going to have to be pressure from the working class, causing disruption at the point of production. It's going to have to be, teacher strikes too can, do great things. Like the Massachusetts Teachers Association voted to have a national teacher strike for a Green New Deal in 2019. Of course, like that's easier to vote on and pledge to do than actually organize. But like if that sort of thing were to actually happen, if we had a national teacher strike on these climate issues, I mean, it would really it would move the needle. And just the language you mentioned earlier, the climate movement is often, a lot of it now today is young people, right? It's the youth, it's Greta, and it's the Sunrise Movement. And even them, they're sort of realizing we need more militant tactics. So they've started to do these school strikes, and they did the global climate strike in September 2019. So the language of strikes, the language of mass disruption to force elites to pay attention is starting to enter the consciousness. But as we in Jacobin world and socialists know that, school children don't quite have the strategic leverage or power that workers do at the point of production to really shut down systems and force change. So we're going to need the workers in the working class in these sectors to really use their power to sort of force a crisis so that we can deal with the crisis.
All right, well said, Matt. That's a great place to end it. Thank you so much for taking the time tonight. This was great. Make sure, again, you hit like and subscribe. Make sure you check out Matt's articles in Jacobin and Catalyst and his book. And again, make sure you join us on Saturday. Tomorrow, we'll have a great weekend show with Ronan Burtonshaw talking about developments in the UK and things that are going on and the transformations in the Labour Party there. So thank you all for joining us. This was great. And I will see you all soon. Have a great night, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Mm-hmm.